Hi, welcome. We're thrilled you all could join us today. On behalf of SEPA and Freedom House, my name is Kevin Shives. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy and the International Forum for Democratic Studies. We're here today to talk about a really compelling topic of China's online influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Everyone is dealing with the global challenge of China these days, and China's influence really is pervasive influence. It's one in which it's touching every sector of society, and not least of most the information space, whether it's through traditional media, whether it's through social media. China's a big story all around the world. Today, we've assembled a really fantastic group of experts. I'll save the introductions for when I introduce them and speak with them. We got a great group, many of which have launched really great analytical tools in this area, many of which have great long experience dealing with China's influence both online and elsewhere in their own sectors and in home countries. So let's get started. So first, I want to introduce Ellie Young. Ellie Young is a research analyst at China for China at Freedom House. Ellie, I want to talk a little bit about how you perceive China's online influence globally. Freedom House came out with a really fantastic report just, I believe, in December that dealt with country studies from all around the world in terms of China's influence in the media sector and elsewhere. The report was incredibly detailed. Your team looked at this issue specifically in Central Europe as well, in Poland and Romania, I believe. What surprised you about your research that you weren't expecting, and really the second report, because Freedom House has really been working on this for a number of years?
Thanks for your very kind introduction, Kevin. And yeah, so we published the Beijing's Global Media Influence Report in September. Actually, we looked at 30 countries around the world, including Romania and Poland. And we were looking at traditional media influence, so covering both print, radio, television, and also social media. And the report covered from 2019 to 2021. So it was actually really interesting. We got to see during this time period that we were looking at in detail, a growing shift and an evolution in tactics and the sort of growing dominance of social media for spreading China's message. So in 26 of the 30 countries we looked at, we found evidence of diplomatic accounts and state media on social media. And while we did track a sort of variation in both style and tone and authentic engagement from viewers as well, what was really surprising was the growing range of languages and countries that were being targeted. So even languages that didn't have a huge target audience, for example, we found social media accounts in Romanian or in Hebrew or in Sinhala, and also targeted disinformation campaigns on social media in countries like the US and the UK, but also in countries like the Philippines, Italy, and Romania as well as a growing range of sort of this artificial amplification of state media accounts. Even if they weren't getting a lot of authentic engagement, they were still really being pushed to the top of search engine results. So all these changes just in the past few years, and definitely sort of an emerging area to look at.
Did you find that China's reach into some of these societies was deeper than you expected? What did you think about this issue of impact of China's narratives across the board? Was it country specific? Did you find some commonalities across countries? What was your assessment?
Again, there was a lot of variation, and we were surprised by that. In some countries where we expected to see more engagement, we didn't see that. So for example, in Peru, we noticed that there was a sort of very hands-off, very limited messaging on both social media and traditional media. In other countries, it was a lot more engaged, with local diplomats really sort of weighing in on local issues, and sort of wading into that. One thing that sort of surprised us, another thing that surprised us was the variety of actors involved. So actually, in Romania, we found that China Radio International, which has been present and broadcasting in Romania for something like 50 years, actually scaled down their radio broadcasts in Romanian, but stepped up their activity online during 2020, 2021. And so it was sort of that change in some actors becoming more involved in the space that we didn't expect, but also, constantly changing their tactics. That was really sort of notable.
Could you zero in a little bit on the findings that you came across with your country studies in Poland and Romania in this region specifically? Tell me a little bit more about what you find, and then I want to turn to Anna to get her perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So our research was based on a new methodology that we created. It's all available online. We tracked a couple of different figures. One was a figure we created to sort of gauge the extent of media influence, and then also local resilience and response. And then based on the interplay between those two figures, we came up with a categorization ranking countries as either vulnerable or resistant to Chinese media influence. And so we found that both Poland and Romania, which were the only countries in Central and Eastern Europe that we covered, were resilient, but we did find sort of major gaps and vulnerabilities in both countries. One source of resilience that local analysts that we worked with really sought to sort of underline and point out was both countries' familiarity with communist messaging and ability to sort of leverage their experience with malicious foreign propaganda from other countries to respond to this growing threat of sort of Chinese propaganda. But we did sort of track these major vulnerabilities, right? One was a major one was this lack of knowledge and awareness of the Chinese Communist Party and its propaganda apparatus, and unfamiliarity with the sort of tactics that it uses to influence journalists and social media influencers. And that sort of presented an ongoing weakness that potentially could be exploited in the future.
Yeah, I want to get back to this issue of later on in the discussion of the post-Soviet, post-communist legacy of Central and Eastern Europe and whether or not that helps prepare them for the challenge from China. But before we get there, let me bring in Anna to the conversation. Anna Kristanovska is the founder of Estima, which is a nonprofit research and consultancy service in North Macedonia. She's got a great background and experience in government and research there. Anna, you were part of the team that developed SIPA's online dashboard to measure both the reach of Chinese propaganda and disinformation in Central and Eastern Europe, but also it made some interesting assumptions about impact. Can you talk a little bit about what this tool was hoped to accomplish? What might have surprised you during the development of it and your own part in the project?
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. Let me give just a little bit of context regarding the research that we conducted with SIPA. 17 local analysts, one from each of the CE countries, joined forces to prepare a tailor-made methodology and reports for each country, aiming to uncover the means that China is using to further its influence in the region. And then we combined our qualitative research with quantitative research, and we analyzed a pool of 820,000 posts published between the period of October 2021 and April 2022. And actually this approach helped us to better understand how China is becoming more and more influential in the region in the past decade, since the launch of the 17+1 cooperation platform, which became 14+1 at the moment. But we tried to uncover the digital tools specifically that China is using. And just to give you one example, for instance, in the Western Balkans region, the conventional literature says that China is expanding its economic presence, and that thanks to this economic presence, it is expanding its political influence. However, this is a bit contradictory, because if we see in most of the Western Balkan countries, there are simply no economic benefits of their engagement with China. So, but still we see enthusiasm for continued economic cooperation. And thanks to our research, we actually understand that we need to look beyond this economic engagement. We need to see how China influences the public debate, how China is shaping perceptions, and all these tools that it has been using basically under the radar and no one has been paying attention until present. And it is actually precisely these tools that are helping China to become more popular, to shape more positive perceptions and become more influential in the region. If we take, for instance, North Macedonia, according to the two recent NDI surveys, we actually see that China managed to increase its popularity from 25% in 2018 to 38% in 2021. And all of this, most of this has been due precisely to China's influence in the digital and information space.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know the big bridge in Montenegro finished this past week, I believe, was sort of the herald to the beginning of it. I'm kind of curious, specifically in the Balkans region, what's been your perspective of this interplay between economic opportunity and this sort of like core democratic challenge that China sometimes presents in terms of, its models of governance? How has that played out in terms of, local elite perceptions and the like?
Well, there are virtually no China-funded or China-implemented projects that have gone without any irregularities, without any deficiencies in terms of good governance. And still, China is seen as an economic opportunity, as a big economic giant. Why? Because in most of the countries, we have systemic weaknesses. We have widespread corruption. We have deficiencies in terms of the rule of law. And these corruption scandals or projects gone bad are not associated with China, but are usually associated with the local actors. The whole debate revolves around the local politicians or government officials that are corrupt, but there is no emphasis put on China, the model that it has been implementing in the region, and why or how this model is actually in the core of all these corruption scandals. The blame is simply put on our local weaknesses and local agency, but not enough attention is paid to what role China has in all these shady deals.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to get back to this issue as well later on in the discussion. Let me introduce Edward. Edward Lucas is a senior fellow and advisor at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. But he also has a very long history as an editor and reporter with The Economist. Edward, this past year, we've seen authoritarian powers, China and Russia specifically, exert themselves into the eastern half of Europe in some pretty unparalleled ways. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the biggest example, but also China has pressured Lithuania following its decision to open up a bit to Taiwan and to establish an office of Taiwan's representation there in Lithuania. How have you seen this pressure exhibit itself online in the Baltic states, where you spent much of your career?
Well, I think that we've seen quite a big change overall. I'm leaving the Western Balkans aside because Anna knows a great deal more about it than me, and and she's given it a very thorough treatment in the last few minutes. But I think overall, both in the Baltics and more widely in Europe, China's on the back foot at the moment. I was just looking back at some of the stuff we wrote in the weekly China Influence Monitor that we had back in 2019 to 2020. And in those, that was the high tide of wolf warrior diplomacy. You had constant aggressive episodes, whether it was with Chinese tourists in Sweden, China complaining about a statue outside the parliament in Copenhagen, bullying a children's publishing house in Germany, violent and really quite rough demonstrations, not exactly violent, but big demonstration sponsored by the Chinese embassy in Vilnius against human rights, pro human rights demonstration. And the 17+1 doing really quite well. And all that's changed. And I wouldn't say that Lithuania's can be praised for this, but I think Lithuania's decision to go ahead with the opening of the Taiwan office sort of exemplified the willingness to have real pushback, picking up the baton from the Czechs, who were the first people really to start complaining about this sort of hegemonic approach of the one China policy. The Chinese have got really quite quiet now. I mean, you don't see the same, if you look at the embassy Twitter accounts, their far less combative than they used to be. I think that it's the story that China has to tell is far less impressive. No one's looking at China now and saying, wow, those guys know how to deal with the COVID pandemic. That was a big thing back at the start of COVID with the Sinovac vaccines, generosity with vaccines, and the idea that the Chinese system was able to do lockdown more efficiently and so on. And that's pretty much gone. It may be still the case in Serbia or somewhere like that, but the idea that we have a lot to learn from China on the public health front is gone. I think that the Chinese backing for Russia in the Ukraine war has both been too little to help Russia win, thank goodness for that, but also has seriously damaged China's image, particularly in the Baltic states, which are 110% behind Ukraine. And so they see, if you're worried about Russia, you're therefore also worried about China, because China's Russia's ally. And so they're facing a really uphill struggle getting their message across. And we also see big countries changing their outlook. So it's now no longer a kind of being an eccentric outlier to have worries about China. You're following on from what soon will be the German policy, is the EU policy, is the British policy, is the American policy. So that gives a lot more space for China criticism. I think that the big point on Lithuania-Taiwan is that Taiwan has not taken full advantage of Lithuania's bravery. To be fair, the Taiwanese were not expecting this. This was something the Lithuanians did because they believed in it. The Taiwanese response has been pretty slow, and there've been, for example, Lithuanian exporters trying to export their agricultural products to Taiwan to make up for the markets they've lost in China, and finding that they can't get certification from the Taiwanese authorities, which is not nuts. I mean, this is your best ally in all of Europe. You should be bending over backwards to help. But once things go beyond the foreign ministry and the president's office, most of institutional Taiwan is not particularly concerned to help Lithuania. So that's been a problem. And we've also, I think the Lithuanians are quite rightly disappointed by the failure of the European institutions really to stick up hard for them in the WTO and elsewhere in response to Chinese sanctions. And that's been a bit of a disappointment. But on the other hand, Lithuania is still there, the office is still open, stuff is happening, although it's a bit late. And to use Mao's famous phrase, I think Chinese wrath is a bit of a paper tiger. The Lithuanians broke this enormous taboo. China huffed and puffed, but in the end, it hasn't crashed the Lithuanian economy, and Lithuania is reaping some benefits. But in terms of the online space, I think it reflects reality, which is that China is now on the back foot.
Do you feel like it's a really fascinating analysis that China's on the back foot that gives some courage to, I think, a number of countries? Do you feel like this was an issue where China overplayed its hand, or do you feel like the response from communities in the Baltics, or perhaps even some of the measures of democratic solidarity that Estonia and others had for Lithuania, do you think they had an impact? What do you think?
I would love to say that China is on the back foot because we're playing brilliantly. I would love to say that the 3 Cs initiative is so amazingly successful that it's left the 17+1 looking completely redundant. I can't say that because it's not true. I think that on the whole, China succeeds where we fail, and the Western Balkans story is probably a part of that. But China fails too. And I can't remember whether it was Martin or one of his colleagues put it very well when they said that mainland China sucks at multilateralism. They just are not good at it. And the 17+1 was an attempt to do multilateralism, and it fundamentally failed. It lacked institutional momentum. It didn't have a proper secretariat. It had no internal cohesion. And in the end, it wasn't really a multilateral organization. It was a beauty contest in which to increase the competitive intensity of the different bilateral relationships. And that, I think, is why it's fundamentally failed. I wouldn't want to be complacent about this. And I think China's still it builds long-term relationships with immense patience and considerable expense. And it remains to be seen how much this really amounts to in the long run. But that we see they're still doing this sort of long-term relationship building, and I'm sure we could do more. to push back against it. And we could talk about Confucius Institutes and here in Britain we have problems with political party financing and so on. But I think if China, when Wolf Warrior was a mistake, it alerted us to the threat and it didn't succeed in gaining them any serious political advantage. So they've dropped that. And I'm not sure at the moment they have an alternative to Wolf Warrior. I wouldn't say they're back to hide and bide, but they haven't worked out how to do a sort of proper charm offensive with the limited exceptions of what we see in places like Serbia.
Thanks. I'm reminded of a study that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute put out maybe 2 years ago on China's use of coercive diplomacy as a tool. It reminds me of the Lithuania case. One of the key findings from that study talked about how China rarely, I think if never, took on multiple countries at a time when it came to using these coercive economic tools or other tools in order to, to get its way on a certain issue, whether it was South China Sea or whether it was an issue in Europe or what have you. And it sort of begged the response tool as, well, you need to have solidarity. You need to show support to others undergoing these things within the democratic community. So let me bring in Martin. Martin Halle is the founder of Synopsis. That's a Czech research nonprofit specializing in China. He himself has a long background and history in nonprofit funding and academic institutions. Martin, Synopsis has been a real leader in civil society responses to PRC's influence in the Czech Republic, and it's been really cited as a model for how other organizations could consider responding to China in their own home countries. How do you think civil society should respond to these developments? And one particular question is, how do you deal with sectors of society that have a completely different view of China? Anna talked earlier about the economic opportunism argument, for example, from perhaps most exhibited by the business community or perhaps government elites. How do those see it as those who come to the issue of China, they see it more as an opportunity sometimes and not a threat. How do you deal with that from a civil society perspective?
Right. So, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me on this panel. I think for the civil society to be efficient in its responses, a lot of things, several things need to come together. So there has to be a coordination, a collaboration, preferably, among different sectors of civil society. So you need to have the area knowledge, the knowledge of China, the knowledge of contemporary China, CCP. But you also need to be well-grounded in your own society. So you also need to know what makes your own society tick and how to present your argument to the society at large. So basically, the academia, the academic knowledge needs to get out from the ivory tower and go down there and get their hands dirty in the sort of like social discourse, public discourse, everyday life. And I think that's, I think if I can say so myself, I think that's what happened in the Czech Republic, where, we have very good cooperation between the academia, the media, and the NGO sector in general. And that ultimately is what makes for a successful response in my mind. It doesn't come entirely naturally because most academics are not trained to go out to the society. They're also not motivated. They're looked upon in the university environment through different prism. So it takes a little bit of effort. And now, how to deal with those people who may have different opinion? I guess you deal with them exactly the same way that you deal with people who don't agree with you on other issues. You need to be prepared for a long, ongoing discussion. Debate even. You need to be prepared for some public controversies and clashes. We've had a number of those. We had a very public spat with the then deputy prime minister 2 years ago. You need to be ready to face threats of lawsuits, things like that. So in short, you need to realize that this topic, this discussion, this debate will be with us for some time. that you need to be patient in explaining your points, and that sometimes the other side, people who don't agree with you, will hit at you through various means. So you need to take that into consideration from the very beginning, I suppose.
Yeah. How did you work on this issue honestly and aggressively within Czechia society without marginalizing Chinese ethnic communities that might be there? Or would you have advice for other countries with very large Chinese ethnic communities, say, Canada or Australia or others who have dealt with these issues?
I wouldn't dare to give advice to places with more established Chinese communities, because, as you know, in Central and Eastern Europe, Chinese communities are relatively recent and also still quite tiny in comparison with, for instance, the Anglo-Saxon world. So, how do you avoid marginalizing them? I think, again, we need to constantly keep in mind that there's a distinction between the CCP and China, and of course the Chinese people. And you need to explain to people that very often the Chinese people, including the Chinese people living in your own country, are the first victims of Chinese repression, transnational repression in this particular case. And we've seen quite recently, we've seen a number of cases in that direction, like the overseas Chinese police stations and things like that. So basically, you need to keep this in mind, and again, like, patiently explain that long term, and make sure that this distinction between between Chinese people and between China as such and the CCP is always there, it's maintained.
You mentioned in your response about working with media organizations, and I wonder if you could dive a little bit deeper into that for a moment before we move on to bring in others back into the conversation. A lot of China's influence is multi-sectoral. It's in social media, it's on traditional media, it's in individual elites sometimes who are parroting, CCP talking points. How did you work in terms of the response note of this with traditional media in a context that is really multi-sectoral and across platforms?
Well, it's in my mind, it's a crucial aspect of our work, and since the very beginning, we've put a lot of effort into working with the mainstream media, because this is your interface with the general public, right? Now, you have to understand that in Central and Eastern Europe, probably more so than elsewhere, the media sector has been in a deep crisis. The traditional model of publishing has been shaken. And because of this, of the fact that most of these languages are quite small, the markets are very small, so the media crisis is deeper than in some other parts of the world. So what it translates into in real life is that very often there's zero capacity in even well-established papers to deal with complex issues like China. They would not have area specialists. They would not have anybody speaking Chinese or even remotely understanding the basic issues. So that's where the specialists, the area specialists, the academics like ourselves come in, right? Like, you can provide this for them, and they're actually welcoming this kind of input because they cannot create it themselves. It's sort of like pennies from heaven for them, right? If it's presented well, if you manage to translate the academic knowledge into a format that's media friendly and sort of easy to understand for the general public. So that's the thing. That's the main step that needs to be taken. For the experts to be able to cross the divide with the general public discourse and formulate their ideas, their analysis in a way, formatted in a way that's accessible to the general public.
Thanks so much. I want to transition us a little bit and bring in two panelists at a time with sort of one question. If you guys could sort of give me 1 or 2 minutes of your response, and feel free to pick up anything else that was spoken to if you guys want to respond to anything or amplify anything that others have already raised. Let's start with Anna and Edward. So this region is really primed to deal with a threat from Russia. Opinion polls generally show pretty negative view among the general public towards Russia. There are a number of negative aspects of the post-Soviet legacy at play, and war really has fairly consistently been on the borders between Eastern Europe and Russia over the past decade or two. But China is a bit the new kid on the block in a way. What are the unique challenges that you think China presents online and elsewhere here in this region? Do you think the region is really ready to deal with the unique challenge that China presents, or can it learn from some of its post-Soviet legacy in dealing with Russia for the last number of a decade or two to develop a threat to China? Let's start with Anna.
Thank you for this question. As you rightfully pointed out, we have had quite a lot of experience in dealing with Russia, and I can say that to a large extent, Russia is already a book that we have read in the Western Balkans. And over time, we developed different tools. Civil society, for instance, has worked a lot on disinformation, on fact-checking, on media literacy, etc. But apparently these tools are not sufficient or efficient to deal with China. Why? Because China's primary focus is not on disruptive activities, on disinformation, fake news, or creating issues within our countries. That was Russia's model or playbook. To the contrary, China has been putting a lot of emphasis on white propaganda. And that is propaganda coming from Chinese official sources. And usually the focus is on overly positive news and largely embellished version or vision of China that these CCP media outlets, but also their local proxies and local medias are putting forward. And we need to have different tools in order to be able to present an objective version, a realistic version of China that our citizens would somehow accept and understand, so that they do not believe that China is this perfect model that we would all like to emulate, and that we should not become as authoritarian or liberal as China, but we should understand that that model brings a number of challenges. But unfortunately, these challenges until now have been absent from the public debate. And we need to shift the focus back to a more realistic and objective picture.
Edward, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree with that. I think that the sort of mystique of the Chinese model's taken a tremendous kicking. And there was a time when Western countries were very keen on good relations with China. The Central East European ones could go along in the slipstream, and they weren't doing anything anyone else wasn't doing. Germany does it, so it's fine if we do it. But I think that the kind of street sense that countries in this region have as a result of the totalitarian past makes them very alert to, they can smell Marxism, Leninism, even when it's dressed up as crony capitalism. And I think that's been a benefit. And I think there's also this underlying thing about human rights, which is still tremendously important, particularly in countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic. These countries really care about it, and all the stuff we've seen about the constantly labor camps for the Uyghurs, the plight of the underground Catholic Church, all these other things, they resonate there, and it's sometimes a source of some bemusement to the kind of old West how much countries in the so-called East really care about this stuff, but they do.
I think that's true. The more I get to know civil society organizations in Central and Eastern Europe and see some of their responses to China or Russia, what have you, I keep getting the sense that the Central and Eastern Europe have a lot more to teach Western Europe at times than the other way around. And it's really quite impressive, some of the leadership and innovation, specifically in the counter-disinformation sphere that's come from this region. Anna, before moving on and bringing in Ellie and Martin back again, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about this issue of information access among the elite and the general public. You wrote at one point in some of your work in Estima that Chinese sources often portray China entirely in a positive light in Macedonian society, downplaying and excluding all the negative elements, which could really help Macedonian citizens create informed and realistic opinion. But elites actually have access to a broader range of sources and language proficiency and media literacy that actually could allow them to have a more realistic view of China, whether that's in the online space or elsewhere. Can you talk a little more about that? It's sort of an interesting dynamic, because we've talked a lot about this issue of elite capture and how elites oftentimes are more subject to Chinese pressure because of the economic incentives and what have you. But you sort of presented it a little bit different idea that they sort of have access to a bigger range of information. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Elites, and here I mean intellectual elites, do have access, do have the advantage to understand foreign media outlets because they speak foreign languages. They have the resources to procure access to different information sources. However, they do not have the incentive. And I think that is the key word here. They do not have the incentive to do anything to somehow demystify or unmask China's approach to the region. And I think that there are three main reasons behind this. The first one is the fact that elites, and now if we could shift to political elites especially, they have oftentimes material benefits in their dealings with Chinese entities, and this comes in the form of bribe, corruption. We saw that, for instance, with the construction deal to build 2 highway sections in North Macedonia, but it's the same case in Montenegro or in many projects implemented in Serbia or Bosnia. Then the second reason why they are willing to side with China is actually the fact that China is more responsive to the needs, to their needs and their promises, the promises that they have made in front of their constituents. Because you have politicians that promise, for instance, we will build or upgrade our thermal power plant, we will build a bridge here, a highway there, railway over here, and then they need to find funding to deliver all these promises to their constituencies. If they ask the EU is sometimes likely to say this project is not financially viable, environmentally sound, or it will take several years to develop all the documentation. But China is willing to provide them with what they need within 1 year or 2 years, and it somehow builds their political capital in front of their constituencies. And the third reason is that they are actually using or abusing the China card when they're talking to the EU and their Western partners in general. And they are, I would say, purely scaremongering. They're portraying China as a sort of alternative, and they're saying to the EU, well, if you do not want to take us on board, if you're not willing to enlarge, then we will improve our relations with China. And then I think that the EU is backing out. They are allowing these political elites to continue with their oftentimes undemocratic practices or authoritarian neoliberal tendencies in order not to push them, as they believe, further into China's embrace.
Yeah, I think that's really comprehensive thoughts on that. I was speaking a couple weeks ago with a researcher in Africa, actually, and talking about this issue. And you mentioned the second point about elites seeing their cooperation and work with China as sort of a badge of respect and credibility within their society. It's that way, according to my contact, in African media organizations or certain organizations, where if they go on a journalist training enterprise to China, or they work a lot with the Chinese embassies, and sometimes that's a real career boost for them in these organizations. So it's something to be mindful of for sure. I want to bring Ellie and Martin back into the conversation. This past year or two has been a lot of big developments in China. I was curious to get your sort of projections a little bit, kind of moving forward, what you think might change in the future about China's online influence. President Xi spoke to the Politburo back in June 2021. He gave a speech emphasizing the need for a more considered and resourced China strategy towards international communication. I think the headline from that was about maybe a softer tone in terms of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, but there actually was a lot behind that speech as well in terms of its resourcing of the international propaganda apparatus from China. Zhao Lijian was just sort of a bit sidelined in terms of a personnel reshuffle at the MFA just this past couple of weeks. He also had the party congress that met in October, really consolidated Xi's power within China and within the party. How do you see China adapting its online influence and propaganda operations? What might change in the future? And we'd love to hear your perspective specifically about what might change online or through traditional media influence and investment in Central and Eastern Europe. Ellie?
Thanks, Kevin. So, one thing that I think would be an interesting thing to keep an eye on changing in the future is this continuing sort of shift in growing increasingly coercive or covert tactics. As you know, we've been discussing this sort of growing backlash and awareness and familiarity with some of the existing sort of strategies, and how, you know, they've failed to an extent. Wolf warrior diplomacy, the sort of more aggressive, more bombastic diplomatic presence hasn't succeeded in necessarily telling a likable story of China, right? So, you know, we saw even after platforms like Twitter and Facebook started labeling state-affiliated journalists, we did see this sort of pretty immediate tactical shift where Chinese media personalities started obscuring their affiliation. Journalists started sort of removing their connection with China Radio International, China Daily. And we are seeing this growing increase in social media influencers who are very familiar with the local language, very familiar with local culture, but who are sort of have this, don't have clear links to the PRC propaganda apparatus in the same way that they might have sort of promoted them in the past. And so they are, you know, they are often a more effective way of disseminating their message. And we're seeing more of this than in the past. You know, we were looking a lot at the sort of outright purchase of media outlets, but we actually didn't see that much in the past 3 years. And I suspect that we're not going to see that too much in the future with the sort of growing economic issues. So there's going to be a lot more like of this like borrowing the boat mentality than maybe outright buying the boat. That's one thing that I'd be on the lookout for. And another thing would be the sort of rise of the lack of transparency issue with both with social media platforms. You know, in some cases, they've been the sort of clearest insight into how we've seen these sort of state-affiliated disinformation campaigns, but that insight can be taken away pretty quickly if researchers aren't given access to those platforms' APIs. And so, you know, you're seeing with less transparent platforms like TikTok or WeChat, we just don't have the insight into what's happening there. And similarly, you know, you see with news aggregators, we saw in Indonesia and Nigeria, and recently I think there were even some revelations about ByteDance's purchase of a news aggregator in the US, right? That were sort of, again, more obscuring this like content moderation. And that can be a really sort of insidious way of affecting the narrative that we just don't have insight into. So I'd be on the lookout for issues like that.
Yeah, perhaps a move from more overt to more covert efforts. It's interesting. Martin, 1 minute as well to think about how China might adapt in the future.
Well, I think overall, like we have discussed, there's now in evidence this shift towards a bit of a charm offensive in Europe overall, but specifically in Central and Eastern Europe. I think for some time now, for a couple of years now, the Chinese leadership realizes that they've essentially hit a wall. And it seems to me that they're now in the process of re-evaluating the situation. They've been sending their diplomats and other people from think tanks to Central and Eastern Europe to sort of test the ground, see what exactly went wrong. You know, how they have come from the heydays of the 16+1 to what we have now. So I think there's this re-evaluation, and we have yet to see what exactly comes out of that. They seem to be looking for new allies, new approaches. But again, overall, I think in terms of larger trends, what is obvious is that the traditional approach from the CCP has been emphasizing propaganda, right? Like the big positive narratives. Portraying China in the best of possible lights, and that was certainly the case in Central and Eastern Europe until very recently. But now we see an increasing use of an increasing deployment of these negative narratives. You know, disinformation, essentially, sort of like tactical. Negative pieces of disinformation that are meant to support the main positive propaganda narrative, and that is something relatively new in the Chinese and the CCP arsenal. It has, I think, it has essentially started with the onset of the pandemic a couple of years ago. Started in Taiwan a little bit before that, during the presidential elections of 2020. But now it's spreading further afield, and it seems to me that the propaganda department of the CCP is not all that well versed in this tactic. They're basically learning the skills mostly from the Russians. They're sort of like copying some of the Russian approaches, but they don't have the kind of weakness that you know, the Russian disinformation sometimes takes on. So it's a learning curve. It's even more difficult in Central and Eastern Europe because of the you know, the very complex language situation. In places like the Czech Republic, they apparently do not quite yet have the language and cultural expertise to do this effectively. But it's coming, and you know, it will be growing, and they will be getting better in it. So we better get ready for it.
Okay, thanks. I want to transition before we take a few questions that have been submitted in advance from some of the viewers, just to ask one question to each of you all. And if you could just limit your responses to 20 seconds. So not much wind up. Go ahead and hit the ball out of the park right away, to use an American baseball analogy. So I'll go in order here. So first, I'll start with Ellie, and then move to Martin, and then Anna, and then Edward. So new platforms online and elsewhere are really popping up everywhere in media markets, seemingly every day. The media market is more and more diverse. Sometimes those are state-affiliated platforms favored by authoritarian-leaning regimes, while others are simply meant to diversify the social media or traditional media landscape that has really been dominated by a few big players. What new platform or media outlet are you worried about being an unexpected source of disinformation and propaganda in your region? So 15 to 20 seconds. Ellie, let's start with you.
Yeah, just going off of my previous answer, I think news aggregators that are sort of growing in popularity are going to be something to watch for, just because the recommendation algorithms on them are so non-transparent. So things like Top Buzz, which was owned by ByteDance, or Newsbreak, I think in the EU this was, which are not just promoting pro-Beijing content, but also sort of potentially have the capacity for this more ideological content manipulation.
Great, thanks. Martin, what about you? 15, 20 seconds.
10 seconds. So I'm really more worried about the traditional platforms, you know, things like WeChat and their impact on the Chinese societies, Chinese diaspora societies in other countries. That's something that's very difficult to tackle.
Anna, what about you?
I would also not go with the new platforms. I think that we're still stuck with Facebook. That is the social media platform that has been most widespread in the Western Balkan region. And it is also the only platform where we have the official presence of Chinese state entities through the embassies.
And Edward.
I agree with all that. I particularly hate TikTok. And I think there's a new element here. Is not just the way in which the Chinese try to get their message across. There's also the collection of data about our societies. If you have TikTok on your phone, you're basically handing over the entire contents of the phone to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that should be more widely known.
Great, thank you. I'll be the fifth respondent and say something along the lines of Telegram. That seemed to be quite a big issue after the Ukraine invasion in terms of its growth and use among Ukrainian society, and not just for sort of everyday secure communication, but also for response to disinformation that was really prevalent in the lead up to the invasion from Russia on that platform as well. And that's a tough one because there's so little content moderation there, because that's by design a secure platform. Let's move on to the next one. So if you could each sort of name one critical or innovative tactic that you think civil society organizations should undertake to address China's online influence, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe. What is that? Let's start with Martin.
Well, I still think that the main, you know, the main thing that needs to happen is to combine the academic world with the public discourse. Basically, a combination of academia and media.
Perfect, thanks. Anna, what about you?
I would go for a combination of civil society and media. I think that civil society should work more with media to somehow publicize all the knowledge that has been produced on different China-related issues.
Especially at the local level. You know, media markets can be so diverse when you have a region where there's so many different languages at play and things like that. It's the local players that really know the landscape best. Ellie, what about you? And then we'll over to Edward.
Yeah, I mean, one really cool thing we saw was in almost all of the countries we looked at, we found that investigations and exposés of CCP influence tactics could be really effective. And so I think, you know, the more peer learning there are between different civil society organizations in different countries, the better that can be, because they have a lot to learn from each other. A lot of them are facing similar circumstances.
Edward?
I think all those are great, and I would just add humor. Communists have no sense of humor. They find it extremely upsetting when we make jokes of them. They don't know how to react. So if you do more of that.
Well, there's some really great organizations out there in Eastern and Central Europe that use satire as such an effective means of bringing truth to the public. One last question for the lightning round before we bring in some of the audience questions and answers. So looking globally, outside, get out of your region for a moment if you could. Outside Eastern and Central Europe, but including Western Europe and the United States, or advanced democracies out there, who I think could actually be learning a lot, as I mentioned earlier, to innovation and responses coming from this region. What's a lesson that you could draw from in dealing with China's online influence in Eastern Europe that might be able to be applied elsewhere? If there's a global parallel to another set of countries and some of their circumstances that they are going through, feel free to draw that as well. So let me start with Edward, back to you.
I suppose the thing that really strikes me is how we are so failing to get across our message in most of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It's really shocking to me with Ukraine that we have got what's basically imperialist war, and in the large chunk of the global south that was subject to European imperialism in almost living memory, this doesn't resonate. You know, these big democracies, Nigeria, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, India, it's a really uphill struggle there, and they see things through the sort of we see things through an east-west lens, they see it through a north-south one, and I think many of their complaints are entirely justified. So my sort of feeling, whether it's when we're dealing with Russia or with China, we can't fix the east-west stuff till we get the north-south stuff right.
That's great insight. Yeah, there really is a bit of a polarization in responses. Ukraine has done fantastic at winning sort of the messaging war in much of the traditional West. But there really has not been many Ukrainian voices that have been elevated to a longer, for a longer extent in the global South. Martin, what about you?
Well, it seems to me that the intensity of the CCP and PRC push into the Central and Eastern Europe through avenues like the 16+1 is exactly the thing that that created the backlash, that led to this very intense response in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of focus in this region now on Chinese influence that I think is not exactly the case in big parts of Western Europe, for instance. So if there's something that regions like Western Europe can learn from Eastern Europe, is that we really need more focus on these issues.
Great. Anna, and then Ellie.
If I can reverse it, because coming from the Western Balkans, I don't think that we have a lot of things to teach to different parts of the world when it comes to China, but we have been taking a lot of lessons from the Central European countries and especially the Czech Republic. So I think that what Martin said even earlier on, I fully subscribe to that, and that is probably the way to go.
Excellent. Thanks so much. We actually drove on the lessons learned from a Serbian organization in a publication we did on dealing with China's surveillance equipment that has really popped up in Belgrade. And they really had some incredibly innovative responses from grassroots responses from citizens in Belgrade. It was really a fantastic example of that. Ellie, let's finish with you before we go to some of these audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily innovative, but I think it's really important and should be done more systematically, but documenting and monitoring issues where Chinese propagandists have tried to coerce or bully local journalists, local activists is really important. Sort of sheds a light on a lot of these behaviors, and also sort of shows that it's not permissible, right? When states respond and have a process for responding. So to the extent that they can do that more, in Poland there was a really great incident where a journalist simply reported on the ways that Huawei had tried to influence his reporting. That went a long way in sort of showing that they're not, just a normal company trying to sort of develop business relationships. Like there are more sort of issues with the businesses that they do. And that went a long way. So things like that.
Great, thanks so much. So Martin, Anna, I want to kick this question we received from an individual over at SIPA and to you. And the question is this: what can we do when the national government itself of a given country proactively spreads Chinese or Russian propaganda? And they were asking this question in the context of Hungary as well. Martin, you first. 30 seconds to a minute if you could.
Well, we live in democratic countries in this region, so if we don't like what the government does, we try to change it. And if the government spreads the wrong narratives, we just use it against the government. And eventually, if you explain to people that the government's policies are wrong, that eventually will contribute to the change of government, as actually happened in places like the Czech Republic.
Anna?
I think that we should work both at the grassroots level to debunk this propaganda that is usually spread by the government, but we have to be realistic that in cases like Hungary or in Serbia, there is a total state capture, and also the local media are simply going forward with this government or Chinese propaganda. So in addition to the grassroots approach or the bottom-up approach, we should be definitely counting on our Western democratic partners to somehow also send the messages, because we do not have a fully controlled information space, as is the case in China, for instance. So there are some channels that we could still exploit, but there should be a combination between the bottom-up approach and the outside-in approach.
Okay, great. Let me bring in Ellie and Edward to help with this question received from the ELTE Faculty of Social Sciences, a lecturer there named Tomas Peregovic. And from what really is he's asking really, what really is the tangible consequence if and when a great power like China is pushing its own narratives in other countries successfully? Meaning, why does all this matter? Ellie, let's start with you and then Edward.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, in some cases, we've talked about how some of the positive narratives that China has been pushing can hide more critical coverage that sort of obscures the full story. And that can be really problematic for countries, especially countries that are less familiar with the CCP and with sort of state of domestic issues in China. But we also see that intimidation and censorship have been pretty widespread, are pretty popular tools that the CCP uses to silence critical commentary, and that can be problematic in its own case. So in our research, we found incidents in more than half of the countries that we looked at of the local government suppressing coverage related to China because of their own interests.
Edward?
Yes, I think there's this idea of hegemonic discourse control is really important, that the Chinese Communist Party reckons that any discussion of China anywhere in the world is their business, and that where they can, they will intervene, whether it's in academia, in publishing, in journalism, whatever. And they feel that's a natural thing for them to do. And that's absolutely incompatible with the way in which our societies work. And there's been, I think it was the 9 points. There was some thing, the leaked Communist Party document a few years ago. I'm sure Martin remembers it, about how the great threat to Communist Party rule is these sort of Western ideas of the separation of powers and media freedom and competitive politics and so on. And I think we underestimate how much they don't like they don't like it when we do stuff like that, and I think the tide has gone out a bit. They've realised this doesn't work, but it's still, the pressure's still there. And I think I'm particularly keen to defend our information space, our academia, our publishing, and our political system from any kind of Chinese pressure, whether it's carrots or sticks.
Thanks so much. And Edward, maybe if I could just ask you one other question that we received from the audience as well, about local intelligence operations in Central and Eastern Europe and the relationship between those and media influence in the region. Do you have 30 seconds you could provide on that? And then I'd like to ask everyone just to give 15 to 20 seconds of any final thoughts that you'd like to get out there before we close and wrap up. Edward?
Well, I would very strongly commend the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian security services for their annual reports, which are obviously mostly about Russia. But this is the stuff that in most Western countries is classified and not talked about. And they made a decision, I think, starting 20-something years ago in the Estonians' case, to have an annual unclassified report on foreign influence operations, whether it's espionage, economic coercion, or whatever. And these increasingly now have a Chinese chapter or Chinese paragraphs. And I think that's really important. And I would strongly recommend that other countries do the same. I think whether the Czechs, Poles, but actually Germans, Verfassungsschutz, Britain's MI5, we all need to be much more open about dealing with hostile state activity and calling it out, saying this is going on, we don't like it, we can see it happening, we're going to try and make life difficult for it. We've tried being quiet about it and it hasn't worked. So let's try being more open about it.
Great. So 15 seconds each for any other final thoughts, if you want to take it or not. Anything else you didn't get a chance to get out there? Let's start with Martin.
Yeah, I think there's one important aspect we haven't discussed, and that's the importance of institutions. We need to build sustainable long-term institutions to deal with these issues, because this is going to be a very long, protracted competition with the PRC in all areas.
Ellie?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, this has been a great conversation. I think one thing that we also, touched on a little bit less was this growing sort of competition of ideas on norms like universal human rights and things like that. That's something that we can sort of focus on in the future too.
Absolutely. Anna?
Well, not one, but three messages from civil society in the Western Balkans. We need to build the expertise to understand China, both in civil society, in media, and in institutions. We need to launch and sustain the public debate and provide counter narratives and different types of information and narratives about China. And finally, we need to push and hold our governments accountable to develop China-related policies that would be actually beneficial for the region and not harmful.
That's great. One great quote I heard from a friend a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to him about the influence of China economically and how you need to invest in people and this expertise. He talked about investing in mines, MINDS, in order to counter China's investment in mines, MINES. Edward, any final thoughts, last but not least, before we wrap up?
No, this has been great. And I think building our Chinese expertise is the most important thing. And we can't outsource this to PRC-sponsored things. I just wish that Synopsis had another naught on the end of its budget and another naught on the end of the number of staff, or even two noughts, because this is what we need, this overlap between civil society, campaigning, investigating, understanding, raising public awareness. And we are late to this. We should have been doing this 20 years ago. People like Martin were on this at a time when everyone else was asleep, but that's no reason not to start catching up now. So bless you for all you're doing. And I want a lot more of it in future.
Thanks, Edward.
Thank you so much on behalf of SIPA and Freedom House. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, check out some of these new analytical tools that Ellie and Anna mentioned, and other work by this group. And we will talk to you later. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening.